Hello, I'm Laura Boswell. I'm a printmaker and today I'm going to show you how to make a Linocut using my registration device and some economy products in my style of printmaking. So today we're going to be working with water-based inks. The inks I've got here, these are Lucas inks, and I have pre-mixed some colours and I put them in these cosmetic bottles because I find that keeps them nice and clean and fresh for my students when I'm teaching a class. The other thing that I'm going to use is extender. That's a big part of my work. It's ink with no colour in it, and it makes, when it's mixed with the coloured inks, it makes them more transparent. So it's a nice product to use if, like me, you like sheets of very thin transparent colour in your inks. So that's made by Graphic Chemical. Don't be alarmed by the colour of it here, that won't show in the print. We're going to use two types of rollers today. One is this one by Esdi. It's got a blue handle and it's a slightly soft roller. It's the best value roller that I've found. They make two, one with a red handle, which is a hard one, which I would avoid for Linocut printmaking, and this one that works well. The other roller is this little red wire handled one. I use this one all the time in my work and it's really great for dropping in detail, spot colour, things like that. And we'll do a bit of that while I print today. And to take the impression, I've got two things here for rubbing the back of the paper. This is called a Baron and it's based on a Japanese woodblock printing tool, but this one is plastic. Again, it's an economy product, but it's brilliant for lino because it's really sturdy and it will give you a good general pressure. The other thing is a trusty spoon, and this can be used to apply spot pressure in areas where you want to just reinforce the rubbing to get more ink onto the paper. So those are the tools we're going to be using. The paper that we're working with, this is called Simili paper, and that's spelled, let's see if I can get this right, S-I-M-I-L-I. It's a Japanese paper, it's a soft paper, and again, it's a very good value paper, and it takes ink well. I am going to use lots of layers of ink today in this demonstration, but I'm going to keep them very thin. How many layers you can use on this paper is very dependent on how you ink up your lino. So just be aware of that when you're working with the paper. I'm going to open up the registration device now, and you can see how filthy my one is. That's because I was using it in the summer at shows and I was printing on rickety tables in fields in front of people. And frankly, printing on a kitchen table is a lot easier than that. So you'll see it's quite adaptable. It's got a bench hook that's holding it steady while I'm working. And I'm going to put my lino, the first plate of lino, into the frame. Now, I normally work by using a reduction method, and that means that my whole picture comes out of one piece of lino and I cut away between layers of colour. For this video, I'm going to use a multi-block lino print, and if you want to make multi-block lino or reduction lino, you'll find films about those on this channel as well. So I'm using traditional artist's lino here, and I've stuck it to a piece of MDF using carpet tile adhesive. You could use double-sided tape, and it's holding it firm in the registration device. I've stuck it to MDF because we have a lot of it here, but it could just as well be used in this device with strong cardboard or card as the backing. So the lino itself, before I even started cutting it, I prepared it by giving it a little sand over with a lightweight sandpaper, very fine grade, just to key the surface slightly. So that's the device. And before I get printing, I'm going to mark up my paper so that I can take it off the device to show you each layer of colour and put it accurately back down. So what I need for that is just a ruler and a pencil, and the registration device comes with these guidelines around it, and I'm simply transferring the guidelines onto the back of my printing paper so that I can reposition. Now, it pays to do this carefully because the more careful you are about putting these lines down on the paper, the easier it is to get everything perfectly lined up and registered so your print stays crisp. So now we've got everything sorted out, I'm going to open up the device and ink up, and we'll kick the paper out of the way over here. Now I'm going to ink up in the device because I'm filming, but if you're doing this, then I would suggest that you keep the two separate. You take the block out to ink it up and then pop it into the device to print it, because that avoids all this mess around here that I've made. So I'm mixing, here's my extender, and I'm going to mix my base colour. So let's have a little bit of this grey blue. Now the thing about extender is that it makes the inks more transparent. If I mixed this to make it paler, if I mixed it with white, it would immediately alter the quality of the colour and make it more chalky. So think of the extender like watercolour adding water to watercolour, I should say. It just makes those darker colours more transparent. So when I cut my paper, I always save the offcuts because you do need to test colours. So I'm just going to have a little look at that. Yeah, that's looking pretty good to me. And I'm going to start rolling this out. These little plastic palette knives are a really good idea. Again, they're very cheap and cheerful. I think they cost about 60p or something. And I have loads of them. Really handy. So what I'm aiming for is to work that extender over the perspex. Now when you use extender for the first time, you'll find that it needs working more than ink with colour in it. Can you hear that thumping? That's me rolling and lifting so that the roller turns. Don't just move back and forth, because that won't help to spread it out as well. Make sure that you lift the roller. So what I'm looking for here is almost like suede. Now with extender, it can be a bit tricky because of course the ink is transparent, so you can't see as well. So you will need to practice a bit if you're using extender for the first time. So I'm now going to start working that over the block. And you see with this, it's a question of back and forth to build up the ink rather than putting a great big layer on all together at once, because I don't want a thick layer. My Linocuts are very influenced by my time in Japan learning about Japanese woodblock, which is a multi-layered, very thin, transparent layered process. So Linocuts for me now are becoming increasingly many layers of transparent colour rather than maybe 6 layers of thicker colour. The other thing about extender is it needs working on the block more than ordinary ink to get a smooth layer. So I'm just going to work the roller back and forth, and this does take practice. So don't be dismayed if at first you start having problems with coverage or roller marks. You will gradually get a feel for how much you need. So I'm just going to cover this, and I'm looking for a very, very thin layer. And I'm not particularly concerned that it's perfectly smooth. The picture that I'm demonstrating for you today is of some falls near Galloway up in Scotland. And it's quite a rough and ready landscape. So it's kind of nice if the inking isn't glassy smooth. And if you look at my work on my website, you'll see that I quite often have textural quality and scanty inking. And I feel that that kind of suits my method of working. So I'm going to bring the paper down and take an impression. First of all, I'm going to work with the Baron, and see how I'm holding it. Fingers under the handle, hand flat down. If you hold it by the handle, you won't get as even a pressure, and it hurts your hand. This way, the weight of your hand's doing the work. So I'm just going to go over it in little circles like this. Now, I'm sitting down because I'm filming, but you might find it easier to do this standing up. I would normally do this standing. So I'm just going to work over the whole piece initially. And one of the nice things about this registration device is it does allow you to have a sneaky peek. and I can see that I need a bit more pressure around the edges, so this is where the spoon comes in, and I'm just going to work around the edges of the print just to catch down and get a crisp edge. Now the thing is about using thin layers and scanty inking is that it's fine for it to be scanty and rough, but it's worth taking the time to get crisp edges, because if you don't have something that's crisp, it suggests that you're just not inking very well. So balance the scantiness with crisp registration and crisp edges to make the print look intentional. Okay, that's coming along nicely now. So now I've taken the first impression, I'm going to take the print off to show you. And you can see that I've got a very, very thin layer here, and it's quite textural, and that works absolutely fine for this first layer because there are a lot of other layers to come on top. So I need to put the print back into place on the registration device, and that's where these pencil guidelines come in. So I'm taking my time just to make sure that everything is properly registered and lined up so that the paper is in the right place and the print stays nice and crisp. So let's get that paper out of the way. So here's my second block, which is the landscape at the top of the waterfall. And I'm going to go back to my ink and just scoop up the ink and make it a little bit darker. Now, when I was a student, I was skint, so I used to do everything I could to save inks, and that usually involved recycling everything I had. And actually that's how I always work, and I find mixing colour into colour is a really good way of keeping my palette natural. So I've got a slightly darker colour, not much, just a tad, and I'm going to do a little bit of flat inking now. And by flat inking, I mean I'm just going to ink the whole block with the wider roller. So I'm just taking my time again to work the extender over the whole thing. And it's ready to take a flat layer of colour. Now I am going to print this entire print without a break. You will do better to let it dry between impressions, and I would be doing that too if we were in the studio. But for this film, I'm just going to print wet on wet so that you can see how the picture develops. So I'll take my impression. And again, I'm going to check whether it needs any work. So a little bit of pressure around the edges. And with this, I'm going to print another layer of ink on the same block. So I'll open this out. And it's just made things a little bit darker there. So for this next bit, I'm going to use one of the little rollers and put in some detail now. Now this idea that you can ink in between cutting or on the same plate is very much a Japanese woodblock thing, and something I do a lot with lino these days. So let's come over here and just let's have a little bit more dark ink going on, and maybe we'll have a little bit of green. So I'm just putting a little bit of yellow ink in there just to start tipping things over greeny grey. Okay, there we go. So let's pop that over here, and we'll use these little rollers. Okay, so this time I'm just going to drop in, and you see how I'm just not putting any pressure on that roller. I'm just more or less letting the roller put the ink down itself, because I want it to be a lot lighter, slightly random. If I see any hard edges that the roller's left that I don't like, then you can always get a cloth and just soften up those edges a little bit. So let's just do that. Okay. And then the device comes back down again. Now, if you're using this registration device, doing these multiple printing is actually really easy. In the studio, I have a great big printing press and it's very physical, taking things in and out lots of times. So I always think that keeps me fit. So I'm just going to work over that again. Okay, I'm just going to have a sneaky peek. That's nice. Now I'm starting to get more layers coming. And before I show you in close-up, I'm just going to put another bit of colour on there. We're going to go to that greeny colour. And let me just check that's okay. Yeah, that's nice. So I'm going to use the roller at a bit of a tilt here just to run a little bit down the edge of the block. So really just dropping it in where I want it. And this time I'm just going to muddle it up a little bit more with wiping because I want to just soften that. Oh, and maybe we'll have a little bit in the tree as well. So let's just drop that in. So you see how those little wire-handled rollers are really handy for putting in those little bits of detail. Okay, let's just... I could do this all day, so I'm going to stop there. And let's just take the impression. So back down it goes. And just going to rub over and see. So by using the Baron here, I'm not putting particular spot pressure on, so it's still giving that kind of textural approach. If I go in with the spoon, it's going to be a much denser application of ink to the paper. So you can control how dense the ink is on the paper by using the spoon to add a little bit more pressure where you want it. So let's just see, maybe on the tree, we'll just go in there with a spoon. Okay. So now I've done that, let me put that down so that you can see better what I've done. And it's subtle stuff, but it's worth taking the trouble. As you can see, the sort of bluey grey bit here is quite soft and random. The darker green down the edges, but it's all still staying crisp. See how those trees are perfectly in place. And combining soft, loose textures with crisp registration is a really valuable tool for producing a great looking Linocut. So now we've printed the first two layers, I'm going to mix up some colour to put the next layer on, which is the grass. And I've cleaned off my Perspex just by wiping it with a damp cloth. With these water-based inks, they clean off really easily. You can see that the Lucas inks are mixing with the graphic chemical extender. The rule of thumb for me with what is compatible is to look at the way the inks clean off. So if they require soap and detergent to clean them rather than just a damp cloth, they probably aren't compatible to mix with the pure water-based ink. So just look at the way that they clean and make sure that all the inks you're using clean off in the same way. So I've added a bit of yellow to my grey-green to make quite a bright colour here. And again, I'm just going to check that out on my tester piece of paper, see what we've got. Yeah, that's quite nice. So I'm going to put a flat layer of this on again. And let's have the big roller. Work that over. Again, I want a very thin layer, because I might well go back and put a little bit of shading in as well. So let's go with that. Now, when I'm cutting lino to print, I like my lino to print without any ridges in the cleared out space. These ridges, when you're clearing out, that pick up ink and print, I tend to call them chatter, and I don't use them in my printing. Some printmakers really like that ridgy look with little random bits of colour, but I don't. So I make sure that when I'm cleaning out, the lino is cut very flat, and sometimes I'll use a carpenter's chisel when I cut ridges I cut away the lino, and then to take all the ridges out, I'll go in there with a chisel and just cut flat. You can see this is very flat. So I'm just working that yellow over the block with my roller. Just making sure, again, this has got extender in it because I've been mixing colour into colour into colour. So the original extender that I mixed in is still there. So we're still dealing with that. So we still need to work the ink quite a lot over the block. And there we go. Okay. Now, I've got some ink in the dead spaces, and that's almost inevitable. So I'm just going to go in there and wipe, and just remembering to keep things clean makes a big difference. People often ask me about how do you keep everything clean when you're printing, and there's no trick to it. It's just being diligent about where you're wiping and cleaning. And while I've been talking to you, I've just noticed a bald patch, so I'm just going to drop in a bit more ink. There we go. So this comes back down again. And I'm just going to take the impression. Take your time when you're doing this. There's no point rushing, and you get a much better result at the end if you just work over the paper carefully. So now that I've taken my impression and put a layer of colour onto the block, again, quite a textural one, I'm going to go back and do that double inking thing and put in a bit of shading. So back to mixing the colour, and let's just make it a bit darker. So let's just park that green over there, and we'll have a bit more of this grey colour. When I'm mixing colour like this, it's a good idea to make sure that you have a little bit more contrast than you think you need, because remember that you are going to be putting a very thin layer on. So if everything's terribly subtle, it can all kind of vanish. So I tend to make things a little bit punchier than I would if I were a painter, for example. So I'm going to use one of the little rollers again. And you'll notice that I'm not cleaning off the block. That's mainly because I'm filming and I don't want to take the time to do that. And you don't have to, but be careful. If you have ink on here that gets too dry, it can get tacky. And if it gets tacky, it can rip the paper. So just be aware of that at home. You do need to know what you're doing if you're going to keep your block still inked when you're double inking. So now I'm just going to start dropping in a bit of shadow, and maybe we'll go even darker. So let's have a little bit darker colour. And here, practice is everything, because it takes a little while to get a feel for how to do this. But part of the trick is not to put too much pressure on the roller. Just let the roller drop the ink onto the block. So let's just have some down here. And think about, this is a rough Scottish hillside that I'm printing here. So I want there to be nice texture in it. Let's see what we've got. And I'm going to check before I see if it needs any work with the spoon. That's nice, yeah, we're getting some nice texture there. Good. So, if I take this off to show you, you can see here the two colours on the block and how they're giving the texture here. And it's a building up process, so there are more layers to come obviously, but we're starting to see this nice kind of roughness in the inking. If you have a quick look at the block here, you can see for a start I've put an arrow on it pointing at the hinge. That's kind of good because I have been known to put those blocks in upside down and that can be very frustrating. So see how this is clean, nice and flat, and just watch your edges when you're cutting, especially if you're hand burnishing the back of the paper, because it is possible to push the paper down a little and pick up ink if there's inks close up to the cutaway area. So now that's finished. So here's my next block, and this one has quite a lot of detail because it's going to put some form into the rocks by the waterfall. And I'm just going to fit that into place and go with a darker colour. So let's use this bluey grey at the top. I'm just going to use a little bit of that in there. So again, I'm not cleaning particularly, I'm just pulling together what I've got on my palette there to get me my new colour. What I will do is push this yellow to the side with the palette knife. There we go. And start rollering out. There was yellow on that roller, I didn't clean the roller off. Now it's up to you how tidy you are. But sometimes I don't clean the roller off between layering on the ink. So again, I'm just going to pop that over. And work the ink out evenly. Just take your time. Make sure that you've caught everything. Sometimes if you struggle with blank areas, just look at it side on and you can see where the light's hitting it and where the light isn't shining. You need to work the roller over that section a little bit more to make sure you've got good coverage. Okay. So down that comes. Now this time I'm going to use the spoon a bit more because I want better coverage. With the green areas, I was keen for there to be lots of texture, and I still want texture on this, but I'd like it to be a little bit thicker, a little bit more matte, rather than lots of texture. So I'm just going to work over it with the spoon as well, just to put a little bit more pressure down. I've got lots of line detail on this block and I want that line detail to show. Having gone to the trouble of cutting it all, it would be nice to make the most of it. So I'm just going to work over and make sure that we've got all that down. So now I've got my detail onto the block, I'm going to go back in and put a little bit darker down the centre, and I'm going to just mix myself a darker colour. I'm going to use that bit of green there. I mean, mixing inks like this, it's a bit like just mixing colours for painting on a palette. I tend to do this as I go. When I work, I don't make a colour study or anything like that to start with. I'm usually making the colour, referencing one colour to the next colour to the next colour. Because I work reduction printing, I'm always cutting between layers of colour, so I'm always responding as I go along. Using a multiple block print like this print is very unusual for me, but obviously it's much more easy to show you what's happening if I have sets of blocks. So now I've got a slightly darker colour. I'm just going to drop that down the middle here, just to give a slightly darker area. Nothing too dramatic, just a slightly darker section. So again, letting the roller deposit the ink. Okay, and then that can go back down. And I'll take another impression. I'm going to start off with the Baron to sort of fix the paper and then go in with the spoon once the paper's in the right place and safe. That's better. Let's put a bit more drama into the middle of it. And you can see how the darker area is working, and also look at how that overlay of shadow on the green is still allowing that green to poke through. That's quite important. And another aspect of the way that I make prints is that I like the layers underneath to have impact on the upper layers. So this next block is the one before last, and it's a less exciting block in that it's just going to drop some shadows into place, and it's going to be quite subtle, but what it's going to do is give depth to the picture, and it's also going to put some more detail into the water. So I'm going back to that darker colour that I was using to drop in the darker areas in the centre of the last layer, and I'm going to ink this one up. Now this means that some of the darker bits, the shadows won't be as obvious, but that's fine. Sometimes when I'm cutting a block, I know that even though I've cut the block, not all parts of it will show, and that's just one of those things sometimes. So I'm just going to take my time, and as always, letting the roller do the work and not putting too much pressure as I'm laying down the ink. Now that I'm getting down towards the water part, I'm going to be a bit more careful about making sure that I've got a nice layer over that, and then I'm going to wipe some of the ink away, and that's because I've already got detail showing in that water and I don't want to lose it all. So I'm just going to apply my printing ink, and then I'm going to use a rag just to wipe away. Now, when you use a wiping technique, it's always a good idea to think about what it is that you're trying to show. So I'm going to wipe away in parallel sort of lines, like so that it gives the feeling of water. The perspective is right. If I wiped away as though I was cleaning a window, the water wouldn't look like water. I need to wipe it in such a way that the white marks work. So I'm just skimming off a little bit of that water. There we go. And then I can take the print. And I'm putting a lot less pressure on when I'm printing now because there's very little lino on the block. And the less lino, the less pressure you need to put on when you're printing. It's only when I get down here where the water is and there's more lino that I'm putting any weight really on there. I just want to check how we're doing. That's better. Good. So I'm just going to go in with the spoon down in the bottom there. Just make sure that I've got everything working. So if you look at it now, you can see the shadows just dropped in there just to make everything look a little bit more three-dimensional, and it's starting to muddle the water a little bit, which just helps with that feeling of reality. Now I'm going to put the final layer on my print, and I'm just going to do what I would have done at college and pull my colours together to make that darkest layer. Often with Linocuts, the darkest layer is just a black, and there's nothing wrong with that in the right place, but it can be a bit harsh. So as I'm talking to you, you can see I'm mixing up a dark colour that's made up of the inks I have been using, rather than going for a totally harsh black on the top of it. So I'm going to use, again, same roller and roll out. And it's really important with very fine detail like this that you don't overload the block with ink, because it can sink in and then come back out on the print. It can go into the sort of dead spaces and come back out and make things messy. So just take your time. These water-based inks do stay open for quite a bit. It's dependent on the weather. Obviously, you'll get away with more in winter than you will do in a hot summer, but they do stay open for a fair bit of time. So you have got time just to be careful rolling out. So again, I'm letting the roller do the work and spreading all over this block. Now, this print is one that I've been demonstrating with this year, and it's one that I sell for charity. I send money every year to the Alzheimer's Research UK in memory of my mum, and this print is for sale on my website if you want a copy, and £5 from every sale goes to Alzheimer's Research. Okay, and again, I've got ink in the water here, and I'm going to wipe away again. So yet another layer of shading to go in that water. So just going to pull away that ink. And if you're new to this, do remember you can always just wipe off, and if you don't like it, go back, ink up again and try again. So practice a little bit. Okay. And down it comes. And I'm being really gentle this time because it's a line block, because it's fine detail. The harder I press, the more likely I am to blur those lines and make them clumsy. So just taking my time and working over. just add a little bit of dark to that. So I'm just going to open that up again. And I'm just going to drop in a little bit more dark down the centre there. So I wasn't keeping count of how many layers we've done, maybe you were, but you can see that the paper is still taking the layering and it's all working okay. I wouldn't recommend that you do this wet on wet on wet. It's not a great idea to do this. Unless, like me, you do demonstrations in fields in front of crowds. It's not something I would generally advise. You'll get a much better and crisper image if you let the layers dry. Okay, so I'm just going to drop in a little bit of dark down this middle bit. And maybe just along the top, just for a bit of emphasis. Okay, let's see what we've got. That's better. And you can see how the registration device just holds everything in place while I'm doing this. This is based on the frame I've got in my printing press, and we just made a handmade version so that I could teach people on desktops. Okay, and we now sell it through my website. There's a shop on there where you can buy it. So here we go. You can see the final print and how that fine line detail is working. So now I've finished this print, and hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into how I work, as well as seeing that you can get interesting results using economical tools and materials. I should tell you there are loads more hints and tips on my website if you go to my resources section, and there's also a list of suppliers. So that's at www.lauraboswell.co.uk. I also treat my social media like a virtual open studio, so there's always loads of hints and tips and work in progress on there. So don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Instagram, both of which you can find me under Laura Boswell Printmaker. Thanks a lot. Bye.